Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And we want to thank you for coming along with us as we continue our study on the life of George Washington. Recalling last week's episode, we found that a fledgling nation had just been thrust into war with the greatest empire to date. Upon hearing of the hostilities at Lexington and Concord, Washington left Mount Vernon to join the Second Continental Congress. It was there, on June 14th, that Congress decided to raise the Continental Army, and that they elected Washington as its commander-in-chief the next day. On June 16th, Washington gave an acceptance speech, refusing any pay, but he was later reimbursed for expenses. In April of 1775, due to retaliations from the colonials, British troops occupied Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in America. But, unfortunately for them, local militia surrounded Boston, trapping the British inside the city, which resulted in a standoff. When Washington arrived outside Boston on July 2nd, what he found was a ragtag army in deplorable conditions. And after much consultation, he decided to implement some of the reforms suggested to him by Benjamin Franklin, implementing militaristic discipline and training. When the Charles River froze over that winter, Washington wished to actually cross the river and attack the British inside the city of Boston, but certain among his generals, such as Horatio Gates, they decided and argued against it, saying that they would much rather wait and hold out until the troops were better trained instead of sending raw recruits to attack these well-garrisoned fortifications. Instead, they suggested to Washington that his time would be better placed to go ahead and secure the Dorchester Heights above the town. And once this was done, the British, realizing there was nothing for it, they retreated from Boston, along with Loyalist supporters as well as women and children. From there, Washington guessed correctly that the British would head to New York in retaliation for what had happened at Boston, and he was correct. Washington arrived there just before the British did and began to entrench himself at Kip's Bay. But it was not very long after that the British had arrived in full force with at least 32,000 men. Washington had less than 25,000. However, the information that he was given was not entirely accurate as to the strength of the British forces, and he was told that General Howe, the new commander of British forces in America, was actually only bringing with him about 8,000 men. So, against the advice of his officers, Washington actually decided to stay put and fight it out. But unbeknownst to him, General William Howe had actually deployed some of his forces at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and it was there that he attacked Washington's flanks. In this battle, Washington and his men retreated from their position to Manhattan. A little-known fact from that particular battle of Kip's Bay is that the trail that Washington and his men took to retreat to Manhattan was actually along the area which would later become known as Broadway. But aside from that, we see that Washington was advised by General Nathanael Greene to actually go ahead and try and secure Fort Washington, which he did do so, but he was later forced to abandon it. At this point, 1776 was starting to come to a close, and, well, Washington and his men had to winter up like everybody else. In case you don't understand exactly why a lot of warfare was not conducted throughout the winter at that time, is think about how hard it would have been for people to travel, get supplies, rations, that kind of thing. And that's the way it was for quite some time. Now, Washington and his men, they had retreated to just across the Delaware River on the Pennsylvania side of things, and General Howe had posted a garrison of Hessian auxiliaries on the Trenton side to keep the Delaware River and the surrounding region secure from Patriot forces. Now, of course, the men under Washington's command were in a pretty bad state, but we see that on December 26th, Washington, fearing that he was going to lose his army from disease, starvation, lack of shelter, clothing, and just desertions in general, he decides to join up with General Knox's artillery, and on December 26th, they crossed the Delaware River. Now, I will have to tell you, though, it's nowhere near like the depiction that you've seen, where Washington's proudly standing up there in the boat. That's one of the easiest ways to go ahead and fall overboard and either drown or simply die from hypothermia. But nonetheless, on December 26, 1776, the Battle of Trenton took place, wherein Washington and his forces surprised the Hessians and took control of the town. Afterwards, Washington decided to move his forces further onward into New Jersey, and it was there that they actually, on January 3rd, 1777, confronted Howe's forces at Princeton. And although this battle was not really a nail in the coffin for the British, it did provide a much-needed morale boost for the Patriot forces, because they only suffered 40 killed or wounded, and in return, they captured, the sources say, anywhere between 200 to 300 British killed or captured. So again, not exactly the greatest victory in the world, but yet it was definitely a huge morale booster. But in 1777, as spring started to roll around and the ice and the snow was breaking up and melting away, General Howe and General John Burgoyne had decided to embark upon a plan that they called the Saratoga Campaign, wherein General John Burgoyne would come down from the north, from Quebec, which was going to be a harrowing route for him, because a lot of the American forces on the frontier, they waylaid the British forces at every turn, cutting down trees to slow their travel, block the paths, and of course you had sharpshooters off in the distance just waiting for the British officers to come by. So, needless to say, it was not exactly the best of situations for John Burgoyne. However, he was confident that the plan was still going to go as well as he could hope, because he believed that General Howe was going to be meeting up with him, and they could continue their plan from there. Unbeknownst to him, however, instead of marching towards outside of Albany, which was supposed to be the destination wherein they would meet, Howe left New York and decided to go southwards towards Philadelphia, which left John Burgoyne at the mercy of the elements in the wilderness and the disease, as well as some of the Patriot sharpshooters. Now, we do know that Washington received information of Howe's movements, and he decided to pursue him, which did in fact result in the Battle of Brandywine on September 3rd, 1777. However, this was not a Patriot victory, and Howe was able to outmaneuver Washington and make his way unopposed into America's capital at the time, Philadelphia. Excuse me. What you don't know is that Generals Gates, Lee, and Benedict Arnold, they actually went northwards without Washington's approval, and they attacked John Burgoyne, resulting in what many people call the turn of the American Revolution at the Battle of Saratoga. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. This was definitely the turn of the American Revolution in the North, because things were going horribly. And granted, in the Southern theater, things went horribly for the Patriot cause for quite some time, until really around the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780. So that was the turn of the tide in the South. Saratoga was the turn of the tide in the North. And the reason it was the turn of the tide was because when news made their way to Benjamin Franklin in France, who was trying to gain French support for the American forces, it convinced the French to actually go ahead and make an alliance with the Americans and give them money and send them troops, muskets, food, clothes, so on and so forth. So that was really what the importance of the Battle of Saratoga was. But nonetheless, we see that because of the Battle of Saratoga, many of the people, officers and politicians alike, who already did not really care for Washington being in command, and they deemed that he was not really the best of commanders, they tried to argue that, oh, well, because Horatio Gates led these forces at the Battle of Saratoga, that he should be the one put in charge. However, Washington's supporters, they firmly resisted against this, and the matter was more or less just pushed to the side. We see this happens on quite a few occasions, and possibly none more so than when the war came to an end in 1777, for the winter time at least, and Washington and his men were forced to winter in Valley Forge, which, if you know anything about that, that was one of the worst times for the Continental Army in the North. But either way, every winter has its end, every spring has its beginning, and we see that with the beginning of spring in 1778, There's not much going on in the north because the Battle of Saratoga and certain smaller other campaigns and skirmishes, battles like that, they would prove to really be kind of the last main actions in the Northern Theater. And in fact, after certain battles, like the battle near Germantown, that was one of the last big battles that Washington would actually fight. In fact, after 1777, he would not fight in a major battle for the next 3 years until 1781. But what we do see is an interesting thing happening is that around this time, Washington actually becomes America's first spy master by designing this ingenious espionage system against the British forces. However, unbeknownst to him, he had a spy in his midst in the form of Benedict Arnold. Now, I know a lot of people, they use the term Benedict Arnold to mean traitor and turncoat and just as a slander, even today. But what you don't know is the reasons why he turned and also the lengths to which he turned once he decided to make that commitment. And we'll actually be planning on doing a video about Benedict Arnold here in the next few months, so stay tuned for that. But it was around this time that Benedict Arnold, he was becoming off-put and overlooked and ignored by the Continental Congress, by the regular officers, who, when he was trying to get a promotion, and he thought, why? Because he is a hero of many campaigns, including one in which he went and fought and won at a battle in Quebec. So he was very off-put by this, and in fact he started to collaborate with the British spy master, Jean-André. And he started to feed Jean-André bits of information in how he would be able to overtake one of the American posts. But unfortunately, shortly after Benedict Arnold had actually given this information to André, he was captured by American forces. André was captured by American forces, and the information was discovered on his person. And when he found out about this, Benedict Arnold panicked, and he retreated to more loving British territory in New York. And it was at that point that Sir Henry Clinton, who was now the commander of British forces in America, he made Benedict Arnold a British brigadier general and actually sent him further south into Virginia to take over certain places like Portsmouth. And it was at this time, though, that Washington, upon hearing about this, he decided to consult with Marshal Rochambeau, one of our French allies, upon what to do, because he didn't want the British going into his homeland, and he wanted to draw them back to the northern colonies, wherein he would be able to try and put a decisive end to the war with French aid. However, Marshal Rochambeau told George Washington that the Southern Theater would actually be the better route to go, and that Cornwallis was a much better prize to go after than continuing to just lightly duke it out with Clinton and the North. And so in August, Washington and Rochambeau, along with the Marquis de Lafayette and others, they started making their way south. And in September, they arrived outside of General Charles Cornwallis's fortifications at Yorktown. And after a somewhat brief siege in which Rochambeau took over the way of how he conducted the siege, because Washington was not familiar with siege warfare. Prior to this, he really only knew about fighting on the frontier, and that was pretty much it. So he deferred to Rochambeau, and Rochambeau conducted a beautiful siege. It also helped matters that our French allies on the naval end of things actually defeated the British soundly at the Battle of Chesapeake. And then the siege of Yorktown came to a close on October 19th. Now, 2 days prior to that, the British had raised a white flag, and for 2 days Washington negotiated the terms of surrender with the British and signed off on the document, and that concluded the siege of Yorktown. And although this was not the end of the American Revolution and not the end of Washington's public career, we see that that was definitely the last pivotal, crucial battle in the American Revolution. In fact, it wasn't until 1782 that the British and French forces started to withdraw their men from American shores. And finally, in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris being signed, the war had officially come to an end when Britain recognized America's independence. And with that, it concluded Washington's time as Commander-in-Chief. And we see that he goes ahead, and before he resigns his commission, he oversees the evacuation of British forces in New York. He's greeted by parades and celebrations. And once that affair is over, he gives a farewell speech to his men on November 2nd, bidding them all a fond farewell. And last but certainly not least, he finally made one last farewell to his officers at Crockett Tavern. And with that, Washington went off to what he hoped would be the peace and quiet of his home life at Mount Vernon. And with that, we conclude today's episode. And we want to thank you so much for coming along. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to go more in depth to give you more details about the American Revolution, but unfortunately, I don't simply have the time, and I don't want to bore my audience to death, so I hope you understand that. If you want a copy of the transcript from this, you'll see where I had to water it down significantly. There's a lot that happened. And quite frankly, with each chapter in Washington's life, it makes you appreciate the man that much more. But either way, when Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, that concluded his time in the military. And with that, we conclude today's video. As always, we want to thank you so much for coming along and joining us on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. And if you haven't yet, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as well as click the bell icon well, you'll never miss an upload. Golly, I got tongue-tied there for a second. Click the bell icon so you'll never miss an upload. But either way, one more thing before I let you go. I do want to let you all know out there that I will be making a special announcement either Sunday or Monday. Have to figure out which, depending upon how my schedule goes. And please stay tuned for that. I think you all will get a kick out of it. And next week, we will continue on with the final chapter of Washington's life. So you don't want to miss out on that. But with that being said, I've taken enough time out of your day. And I just want to say, for now, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.